On November 8, 1965, a 52-year-old woman was found dead in her Manhattan townhouse. Between the time her body was discovered and about 6 hours later, FBI agents swarmed that townhouse and took all of her documents, all of her files, everything they could find. Quickly, an autopsy was performed with the conclusion that this woman died of a combination of barbiturates and alcohol, circumstances undetermined. Despite that confusing message, there was no investigation. None of her colleagues, none of her people that knew her, none of her family, nobody that knew this particular woman stood up for her and said, that's not what would have happened here. More than 10,000 people went to her funeral, weeping over the loss. And this woman was buried, and for 55 years, almost 55 years, she was ignored, she disappeared. That is, until now. The name of that woman was Dorothy May Killgallen, and as you will learn, she was murdered. And for 53 years, she has been denied the justice she deserves.
Time now for everybody's favorite guessing game, What's My Line? First, the popular columnist whose voice of Broadway appears in papers from coast to coast, Miss Dorothy Killgallen.
Okay, how many people remember Dorothy Killgallen from What's My Line? There must be somebody out there who doesn't. Well, you know, that's exactly where I stood. That's all I knew about her. That's all I knew about her. What's My Line? Well, now I've written 2 books about her, The Reporter Who Knew Too Much and Denial of Justice. Let me explain, too. This is my 4th book about the assassinations. The first one had to do with this guy, Melvin Belli. How many of you remember Melvin Belli? All right, well, I knew Mr. Belli in the 1980s in San Francisco. I practiced law in his building. I got to know him. Quite a character. As you know, he represented Jack Ruby. And when Belli died in 1996, I decided to write a biography of him because I looked at 2 autobiographies he had written, and they conflicted. Now think about that a minute. But that was Belli. What was most interesting to me was Belli's representation of Jack Ruby. I never bought that psychomotor epilepsy insanity defense. For God's sakes, it made no sense, and you're going to hear more about that tonight because it didn't make any sense. But more than that, too, about Belli's affiliation with the Mafia. He loved the Mafia, one guy told me, and the Mafia loved him. His main client was Mickey Cohen, who was a Los Angeles gangster. He loved to be around him and have people think that he was a mobster. So I finished that book, and while I was looking at that, I'm a former criminal defense lawyer, and I've analyzed cases on television and so on and so forth, and I always looked at motive. And I always wondered about his representation of Jack Ruby and what that had to do with the 1960 election when Joe Kennedy double-crossed those mafioso who had helped them win the presidency. Joe told them, hey, you help us win Illinois and West Virginia, and we'll leave you alone. Right away, what'd he do? He appointed Bobby Kennedy Attorney General, and Bobby Kennedy went after those guys, didn't he? Well, I wrote a book called The Poisoned Patriarch, How the Betrayals of Joseph P. Kennedy Caused the Assassination of JFK, and I looked at the assassination, I believe, differently than anybody ever did. I looked at why Bobby Kennedy wasn't killed instead of why Jack Kennedy was. That changes everything. Bill Alexander, who prosecuted Jack Ruby, when I interviewed him, said to me, well, you know, Bobby Kennedy had a lot more enemies than Jack did. So I looked at it that way. I wrote about Joe, and I did all that, and I was done. Well, I just have read 3 biographies this year, Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, and Einstein. I hope by reading those I would get a lot smarter. But what I found out in there is each of those 3 men had one thing in common, curiosity. And I believe through writing all of my books and what I've done in my life, I'm a curious person. Well, while I was interviewing people for the the Melvin Belli book, I ran into a doctor in San Diego. And I started talking to him about Belli, and he gave me some good facts and things. And then he said, you know, Mark, by the way, he knew Dorothy Killgallen. And I said, well, what? He was on What's My Line? He said, no, you don't know anything about her. Dorothy Killgallen, yes, she was on What's My Line. She was the smart one on the end down there who guessed the occupations of people more than anybody else, right? But also she was syndicated in 200 newspapers across the country, the Hearst chain, Voice of Broadway, articles, everything. And this is actually back when, remember, when they actually read a newspaper. She had a radio show with her husband, listened to by 1 million people a day in New York, and she covered, as an investigative reporter, some of the most famous trials of the 20th century. Lindbergh baby kidnapping case, all right? Dr. Sam Shepard. I'm going to show you a photograph of Dorothy in the courtroom at the Dr. Sam Shepard case. And, he said, the Jack Ruby trial. Well, that really kept in my mind. I kept thinking about that, and I decided that I would start to look into Dorothy Killgallen and see what I could find. And I'm going to take you tonight on the same journey that I took to learn about Dorothy, ascending from a college dropout to what the New York Post called the most powerful female voice in America, that Ernest Hemingway said was the greatest female writer in the world. It's a great, inspiring story, and I'm pleased to say that the Reporter Who Knew Too Much has become a bestseller, going to make a film out of it, it looks like, and all of that. And people around the world I've heard from who are inspired by this woman's story. It's an amazing one. But let's look at What's My Line, okay? Well, I'm sure you can all name who's there. Bennett Cerf, Arlene Francis, right? And the host was? John Daly, of course. Well, you know, she was kind of the hard-edged one, wasn't she? I don't know if she was your favorite or not. I don't remember watching it too much. But it was an intellectual quiz show. Kind of wish we had something like that today. But Dorothy was smart, and she would guess the occupations of people more than anybody else. So I started looking more into Dorothy, and the evidence tonight, some of it will be evidence that's never been presented before. So here's her column, The Voice of Broadway. I don't know if you ever read it. It was mostly, as I say, in those local newspapers in the cities across the country. Well, she was a Pulitzer Prize nominated writer, and if I could write even half as well as Dorothy Killgallen did, I'd have 25 bestsellers. If you get a chance, go to the DorothyKillgallenStory.org. Look at her columns she wrote that we'll talk about. You'll read some of her writings in both Denial of Justice and The Reporter Who Knew Too Much. What a gifted wordsmith, and you're going to hear some of that, especially when she describes Jack Ruby. All right, Voice of Broadway and everything. 35-year career, called the most powerful female voice in America. All right, here's Dorothy at the Shepard trial. This might be my favorite photograph of Dorothy. Look at that. Dorothy right in the middle. All the columnists, all the newspaper people, all circulated around her. You can almost see the respect there for her. Dorothy was a woman of integrity. She went after the facts. She didn't have a conclusion and then fit the facts to that. She came up with the facts and then had a conclusion, unlike what we see today. How many people from around the world, Iceland, Australia, a soldier in Iraq, other people have emailed me since the books have been published and said, I wish we had a reporter like Dorothy Killgallen today. God willing, I wish we did too. So she covered that trial, and if you don't remember, Dr. Sam Shepard was supposed to have killed his wife. There was a one-armed man, remember? What movie did it become? The Fugitive, of course. Now, when JFK died, she became obsessed with that case. Now, why did that happen? Well, first of all, she was a very good friend of JFK's. He had been to her home and played charades. She saw him at the Stork Club when he was a senator. They became very good friends, and she just wept when he was killed. But the real topper was this. This is Dorothy's youngest son, Cary. And you can imagine how a mother would feel when the President of the United States permits you to come to the White House, and while you're there, Pierre Salinger sets up a meeting between the President of the United States and little Cary. And he makes a fuss over Cary. He tells him, look, Cary says, I brought letters from my third grade class, and JFK makes a fuss over those. It gives him a PT-109 pin. just makes a real fuss over him. And so when Dorothy tried to describe what had happened when JFK was dead, this is what she wrote. The picture that stays in my mind is one of this tall young man bending over a small boy, carefully scrutinizing envelopes until he came to the name Carey, grade 3B. This is the man who was assassinated in Dallas. You see, her interest in the JFK assassination wasn't business, it was personal. She was just an absolute bulldog when it came to cases, searching for the truth, always looking for the truth. That's who Dorothy was. So I began looking into her investigation of the JFK assassination. And what did I find? Yeah, she spent 18 months. And here's why, and I'm going to talk about a few books later in not a very nice way. Here's why. She's the most credible reporter to have ever investigated that JFK assassination. She's unlike all of these fancy authors or self-styled experts or whatever. You know why? Because she was there in the front row at the Jack Ruby trial. She listened to the witnesses. She watched them. All right? First-hand eyewitness. I'm very proud of the fact that my books don't speculate. I find primary sources, not what somebody said to somebody who really witnessed what happened. So the first one that I found, in fact, I didn't have this in Reporter too much, and then I found it, fortunately, for Denial of Justice. This is the column called Ruby, Stars at Last. And right away here, I hope you'll be as impressed with her writing as I am. She was describing seeing him. The hustler in the black suit and the very white shirt, neat and nervous, is the star of the show at last. Ruby stars at last. If he died tomorrow, and he won't, he would die happy in the knowledge that he had made the big time. Yet little more than a half hour later, the defendant bounced back quietly into the courtroom, lightly, like a dancer under clumsy guard. Well, you feel like you're right there, don't you? That you can see him. I was standing by the bar railing as he turned to take his seat, and he broke into a quick smile, gave me a friendly, bird-like nod, and said hello, brightly. Then everything quieted down as Judge Joe B. Brown returned to the bench. Jack Ruby became just a head in the crowd, up front, a bald head shadowed by a few pen strokes of black hair. Jack Ruby, described by Dorothy Killgallen, who was just a few feet away from him during that trial. So what did Dorothy do? Well, she started looking into the facts. And I will tell you right now, she was not interested in Lee Harvey Oswald. He's a dead end. He's been a dead end for 50-some years. And yet there are those people who will continue to perpetuate this ludicrous Oswald alone theory. Well, Dorothy didn't buy it. She looked at the one person that she could investigate and where she would find the truth, and who was that? It was Jack Ruby. First thing she did was ingratiate herself with Melvin Belli, Joe Tonnehill, and the defense team. She had dinner with Belli and Tonnehill, and you're going to see proof of the fact that she did as much as she could to learn everything from them. So then Dorothy began to do what she needed to do. 7 days, after JFK was killed, she wrote the first of scathing columns that would end up causing her death in 1965. All the enemies looked at these columns. Dorothy Killgallen wasn't going for this Oswald alone theory stuff. She was doing her own investigation, and what's the name of her first column? The Oswald file must not close. President Lyndon Johnson has been elevated so swiftly to his high post that in one sense he has been snatched up into an ivory tower. He is no longer in a position to hear the voice of ordinary people like me talking candidly. And if he could walk invisible along the streets of the nation and listen to ordinary people talking, he would soon realize he must be sure that the mystery of Lee Harvey Oswald is solved and laid before the nation down to the smallest shred of evidence. If Oswald is President Kennedy's lone assassin, he is the most important prisoner this country has had in 100 years, and no blithe announcement in Dallas is going to satisfy the American public that the case is closed. And then listen to this. The case is closed, well, is it? Well, I'd like to know, in a big smart town like Dallas, a man like Jack Ruby, the owner of a striptease honky-tonk, can stroll in and out of police headquarters as if it was a health club at a time when a small army of law enforcers is keeping a tight security guard on Oswald. Security. What a word for it. Dorothy on the job, going against the grain, driving the wrong way on a one-way street, because everybody is doing what? Here's J. Edgar Hoover shouting, Oswald, 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 Oswald alone to the world. And everybody bought it, brainwashed everybody, and they missed the truth. Dorothy didn't. She didn't buy it. Another column, DA to link Ruby to Oswald. Right away, she knew that Ruby was the key. Ruby shot Oswald. We got to look at Ruby. And she talked about that in here. Mark Lane called her the only serious journal investigating the JFK assassination. Enemies circling, watching what she's writing. Now we have this information. We have, of course, Ruby shooting Oswald. What did she do when that had happened? Dorothy Kilgallen arrived in court yesterday and stopped the show. Joe B. Brown, one of her fans, gallantly granted an interview in his chambers. Belli of San Francisco and Joe Tonahill took her to lunch at a nearby seafood house named Vincent's, whose oysters Belli declared are the best this side of Fisherman's Wharf. What did Dorothy write in that column, in the next column? I don't see why Dallas should feel guilty for what one man or even 3 or 5 in a conspiracy had done. She was already looking in to the fact that one man didn't do this. And she knew also, she wrote a column, and this is something that a lot of people have missed. Years later, Jess Curry wrote a little autobiographical magazine. Well, she interviewed Jessie Curry. And in here, you know what it says? Guess where he sent the officers first when JFK was killed? Not to the book depository, not to the grassy knoll, but where? The overpass. He sent them there. It's in here. It's in his words. Dorothy wrote a column about that. J. Edgar Hoover then, and I have the FBI file, he had the column. He was watching what she was doing, and you see written on it in his handwriting, wrong in capital letters, wrong, wrong, wrong. He knew what Dorothy was doing, and he was one of the first enemies that she really had. All right, now, all these authors, boy, I'm going to talk about their books in a little while, but, they don't even think Dorothy Kilgallen was at the Ruby trial, and they certainly don't think that she interviewed Ruby. Well, first of all, here's a photograph. Who's that? That's Belli and Dorothy, isn't it? Pretty good proof that she was at the trial, wouldn't you say? All right, let's look at the next one. Well, in fact, let's look at this video. If there's any proof that you need with regard to Dorothy Kilgallen being at the Ruby trial and being involved heavily in this, watch this.
You're asking me prognostically rather than in retrospect. Now, the ones we've had, we decided we didn't want those who saw it. I think they saw some
You're talking about jurors.
Important things. Now, prospectively, here in Dallas and away from Dallas, when we are moved, we may have to take some who have seen it on TV, not because they're qualified, but because eventually we want to get to trial. But we're not going to go to trial here unless we're forced to trial with witnesses who saw this on TV.
How long does a person have to live in Dallas County to be a prospective juror?
What are the residents required?
A year in the state and 6 months in the county.
Is there any chance that you might get a transplanted Chicagoan or New Yorker or someone from another state?
Just had one.
Just had one who sat in the jury up in New York.
The one we challenged for cause to keep from being disbarred.
There she is.
New York Central for the first time, I guess.
Her leopard coat.
In an American court up in Ohio.
She was a sharp dresser, wasn't she? There she is. Okay. Now, 400 reporters at that trial. How many of them interviewed Jack Ruby? 1. Twice. In the books, I have a photograph of the Ruby trial courtroom, and there's a railing between the spectators, media, and the council tables. Right behind there, Jack Ruby was interviewed by Dorothy Killgallen twice. And you want some proof for that? Well, I'll give you some proof. Here's Joe Tonnahill explaining about the interview that was permitted by Dorothy.
He wasn't uttering nonsense because this interview with her was a very significant point in his classless life, you know, and I think he enjoyed it very much and cooperated with her in every way that he could, and told her the truth as he understood it, and it was just a very agreeable conversation between them, and I just can't understand people doubting the sincerity of that interview, because it was, to me, I watched them and it was a very sincere discussion going back and forth.
That's history, isn't it? That's history. All these videos, there's more than 50 of them, are up on the DorothyKillgallenStory.org. That's all shown in both of the books, where you can go look at those for yourself. What I like to do is present the facts for people and let them make up their own mind. Look at these things. That's history. She was there. And I'll tell you how many authors in a little while say she never even was at the trial or interviewed Ruby. So she wrote a column on it, Nervous Ruby Near Breaking Point. And again, the prose is amazing. Jack Ruby's eyes were as shiny brown and white bright as the glass eyes of a doll. He tried to smile, but his smile was a failure. When we shook hands, his hands trembled in mine ever so slightly, like the heartbeat of a bird. I'm nervous and worried, he told her. I feel I'm on the verge of something I don't understand, the breaking point maybe. When Killgallen told Ruby, I think you're holding up pretty well, he said, I'm fooling you, Dorothy. I'm really scared. She wrote, I went out of the almost empty lunchroom corridor wondering what I really believed about this man. Now you're probably wondering, what did Ruby tell her? I wish I could tell you. Because when Dorothy Killgallen died, her files, her documents, everything disappeared. They've never been found. I think I know where they are, and I'm going to keep after it. I'm going to find that file if it's the last thing I do. But we don't know what he told her. The only thing we do know is shortly thereafter, she didn't go to Washington, D.C. to look into the government or anything. She didn't stay in Dallas looking into LBJ. She didn't go to Cuba looking at the Cubans or Russia. Where'd she go? She went to New Orleans. She went to New Orleans because Carlos Marcello, one of the most dangerous mafioso in the country, the one with the greatest motive to have killed Jack Kennedy so Bobby Kennedy was powerless, which is exactly what happened. That's where he was, and you'll hear about that a little bit later. Okay, so then what did Dorothy do? You know about when the Pentagon Papers were released, or the Nixon videotapes or anything? Well, Dorothy had a hand in same sort of thing. She exposed Jack Ruby's testimony before the Warren Commission before it was supposed to be released. Now, that's a big deal, if you can imagine. On the front pages of the paper, outcry over Ruby leak brings a federal probe. Dorothy had integrity, and that integrity connected with people trusting her with information nobody else got. I don't know if we've got anybody like that today. We don't have a Walter Cronkite or anybody else like that today in news that I know of, or somebody like Dorothy. They all trusted her with material. They knew she'd keep her mouth shut, and in this situation she did, because J. Edgar Hoover was absolutely furious when this obviously appeared in the newspapers before it was supposed to be released. He quickly dispatched these agents, and I like to give you this visual. I kind of look at it like these two great, they probably weren't, but great big beefy FBI agents go over to Dorothy's, $1 million townhouse, and here's little short Dorothy, and they sit her on one of her expensive couches and they grill her for hours. Where'd you get this material? Where'd you get this material? I love to think about that image. Well, they weren't successful, because I was fortunate to find in the National Archives a memo from Hoover to the Warren Commission describing for the council there the fact that they had tried to get the sources. And what he had to say was, Dorothy refused to reveal the source, said it was a responsible person who had a legal right to the transcript. She was the only person who knew the identity of the source. And if you want one comment for her that describes the integrity of this woman, it is this one, that she was the only person who knew the identity of the source, and she would die rather than reveal his identity. Imagine that J. Edgar Hoover's a little upset with that. Of course he was. The enemies are circling. Okay, now we get one more column here. Maybe you didn't know. From what I have read, I would be inclined that the FBI might be more profitably employed in probing the facts of the case rather than how I got them, which seems as a waste of time to me. At any rate, the whole thing smells a bit fishy. It's a mite too simple that a chap kills the President of the United States, escapes from that bother, kills a policeman, eventually is apprehended in a movie theater under circumstances that defy every law of police procedure, and subsequently is murdered under extraordinary circumstances. She didn't buy all that. She didn't buy that Oswald alone stuff. She didn't buy what everybody was saying happened at that time. And then, of course, with regard to the Warren Commission, I'll talk about it in a minute, the Warren Commission report, she summed it up in one word: laughable. That's what she thought of it, and she was right. So on Ruby's state of mind, she talked about what he had gone through, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. So with all this research in mind, I went ahead and tried to see if I could find some eyewitnesses, some primary sources who knew Dorothy. And I was very fortunate to find the fact that videotaped interviews with 4 people had been possible. You already saw one of them, that was Joe Tonnahill. Her 2 hairdressers, her best friends, Mark Sinclair and Charles Simpson, and a woman who was on the last What's My Line show with Dorothy. And with these videos in mind, then we can kind of get an idea of what Dorothy was going through. You almost can hear the drum beat of the fact that all these enemies are circling Marcello. She's gone to New Orleans to look for him. Look at what he's doing. You've got Hoover. You've got other people who are looking at what's going on. And obviously, as I say, she's going against the grain. Well, let's see if we can figure out exactly what was going on in her mind. So let's start with Mark Sinclair. He was a very, very close friend of hers, her hairdresser. She trusted him with everything. And this is what he had to say about her talking about, they all knew that she was investigating the JFK assassination. All right. He actually went to New Orleans with her, by the way, and while they were there, and she was putting together what she believed would work. By the way, she was working on a book for Random House that she was going to publish at the end of 1965, just after, a few months after she actually died in November. And in that, she was going to put all of her facts, conclusions, evidence, and everything in there. And Sinclair went with her to New Orleans to tie things up, and she immediately sent him right back to New York and said, "Don't ever tell anybody you were here. Go back there now, and don't ask me any questions." Then he also then talks about what she said about what she was doing, her investigation.
She wouldn't stop on it. Pre-warning, exclusive, yeah. So she had it all. And she told me all about this, and she told Donnell was there too, so he knew. We knew what she was doing.
At this time,
she said that this would be the case of a lifetime, a story of a lifetime, that she would prove that the president was assassinated. Who assassinated the president?
Case of a lifetime. Going to prove who killed the president. How about Dorothy's state of mind with regard to this? She wasn't a dummy. She had to know that the enemies were circling. All right? She was a smart woman. Let's hear what Mark says about that.
Around this time, you used to get her ready for her What's My Line show, and you would sometimes play the game of What's My Line.
Yeah, I played it all the time, yes.
Where you would pretend to be a contestant, like you make...
We would play the game. Donnell was there, and we would play the game around her.
While you were playing the game once, Did she ever say something out of the blue about threats on her life?
Yes. She told me that this is a couple of weeks before she died, or maybe 3 or 4 weeks before she died. I'm not sure the time anymore. But she told me she was going to get a gun because her life was being threatened, and she was scared for her life and for her family.
Going to get a gun, scared for her life, scared for her family. Gives you a chill almost. She told other people, yes, I'm going to break the real story and have the biggest scoop of the century. And one of Dorothy's problems with this, and one of the things that led to her death, was that she was a blabbermouth. She told everybody what she was doing. She made comments like that in public. And again, these enemies are out there. Hoover, who wants to just bundle up the thing and have it go away. Marcello, other people who could have been exposed in her book for Random House. So let's also get then the opinion of another hairdresser, and that's Charles Simpson. Let's see what he has to say about Dorothy's last days. This is Charles Simpson.
Did you have the feeling that she was investigating the murder case of Jack Ruby killing Oswald and Oswald killing Kennedy? Was she digging into that?
She never quit. She never quit. She dug up something. She dug up something about the assassination of President Kennedy that somebody didn't want her to know, because she even told us of her own volition. She said, I used to share things with you guys, and she said, but after I have found out now what I know, she said, if the wrong people knew what I know, it would cost me my life. And she
Hope
was
you can
dead
all
about
hear that. If the wrong
9 months
people
later.
knew what I know, it could cost me my life. And then Charles Simpson about the Warren Commission and what she was doing.
She had a copy of the Warren Commission testimony sometime before.
She printed it on. She printed on the front page of the Journal American before the president received it. And therein lies the tale. From then on, we were stalked.
Who's we?
Mark, myself, our phones were tapped. They were trying to find out where she got her information from. That she could get this information before the president got it, who was then President Johnson.
Now, it's easy to talk about this now because it's so many years later, but try to put yourself in that situation that Dorothy was in, all right? It's like today when somebody knows something that nobody else knows, and they realize if they expose it, they're going to be subject to, who knows what can happen. But Dorothy knew that she knew too much. She was the reporter who knew too much. And so she's scared. People have asked me, why didn't she take measures? Yeah, she bought a gun and all that. Well, she thought she was invincible. She was the biggest star of the time on Broadway and across the country. The most powerful female voice in America. She didn't think anybody could touch her. So what was she doing at that particular time? Because there's only 3 ways that Dorothy could have died. She could have committed suicide, accidental death, or what? Murder. Well, Dorothy was Catholic to begin with, so suicide's a question mark. Plus, she was on top of the world. She was planning a trip to London. She was working on the tell-all book for Random House. She had a movie deal for the book. She had a lunch planned for the Monday after she died. All of those things were happening, and Mark Sinclair, if you saw a video, said she was just sparkling on the night she went to What's My Line. He helped her put on a special dress. He put some flowers in her hair. All of that kind of thing. And then if you watch the last What's My Line show, and I'm pleased that an awful lot of young people have been inspired by Dorothy and they watch her now on What's My Line. If you get a chance, go in there and take a look at some of those What's My Line show. The best one, probably the funniest, is one with Groucho Marx that you would enjoy. But watch her last show. Now remember, the medical examiner says what? She died of barbiturate and alcohol, right? So, what happened that evening? Was she groggy on What's My Line? Did she show signs of some drug problem or something like that? Joe Tonahill, in an interview, says he had lunch with her in New York about a month, I think, before she died. Her mind was sharp. She was just in great spirits and all this kind of thing, okay? Well, on that last show, you're going to see, once again, Dorothy guesses occupations like none of the others could. And one of them was with Catherine Stone that we'll mention in just a minute, but you can see that. So what does Dorothy do? She is on What's My Line. She leaves there and goes to a bar in New York called P.J. Clark's. Maybe you've been there. I've been there. I've sat right next to where Dorothy sat on November 7th, 1965, right there. She had fun, and then she met a mystery man. Dorothy Killgallen, in my books, it's warts and all. Okay, Dorothy had a side to her that many people would probably have problems with. Her husband, Richard, was a Broadway producer when she met him. He fell on hard times. His creative abilities went nowhere. He ended up being an alcoholic. He ended up wandering around with other women, and Dorothy finally was lonely, and she ended up going out with a singer that many of you may remember named Johnny Ray, the little white cloud that cried. Remember that song? He was a known homosexual. Well, he wasn't a homosexual. He was obviously a heterosexual because they had a torrid love affair, to the extent that I will tell you right now that Dorothy's son, Carrie, and this was something I had to really consider whether to put in the books, is not Richard's son. He is Johnny Ray's son. And I've been able to show that and prove it because if you look at pictures of young Carrie, the one she took to the White House, I saw one on the cover of Good Housekeeping back then, or on an article in Good Housekeeping. He has golden hair. Richard had dark hair. Johnny Ray had golden hair. So she had an illegitimate son, Carrie. Well, Richard found out about that. He threatened to kill Johnny Ray if they kept up a relationship. So there's obviously motive for Richard to have been involved in Dorothy's death. And he's one of the main suspects. Both books are true crime murder mysteries. I set up the facts for you. I give you all the suspects, and you can make up your own mind. One of them's Frank Sinatra, I might add. She and Frank Sinatra hated each other. She wrote a scathing column about him, his bimbo girlfriends, his affection for the mafia, all of that. So he struck back, and he called her the chinless wonder. If you remember when Dorothy was on What's My Line, there may have been a little absence of her skin. She was not a beautiful woman, but she was an attractive, sparkling type of a woman with her personality and all that. At one point in Las Vegas in his act, he held up a key and said that was her figure. He said, if you run into Dorothy Killgallen, do it with a car. I mean, they did not like each other at all. So I put Frank Sinatra in the book as a suspect. You can make up your own mind as to what may have happened there. She also had an affair with a guy named Ron Pataki. Now, before we get into him, let me tell you what I was able to do. There had never been an autopsy report published about Dorothy's death. Well, I couldn't find one either, and the New York Medical Examiner's Office wouldn't give me one because what? I'm not a member of the family. Well, my wife, who's head of cataloging at the Santa Clara University Library, has a friend, both of us do, at the Library of Congress. We got in touch with her because I just had this feeling that maybe that autopsy could be at the National Archives. And that's where we found it. And so I published it in The Reporter Who Knew Too Much. And as I said before, I'm not the greatest researcher who ever lived. Autopsy report, can we put that up? I'm not the greatest investigative reporter that ever lived. But I looked at this, and remember, what's the determination? She died of a barbiturate and alcohol. Well, barbiturate was supposed to be Seconal, which is sleeping pills, right? I read down through here. I found Tulinol in there. Tulinol is a step up in terms of medication to help you sleep. So she had 2 barbiturates in her stomach. And I'm trying to figure out whether it's accidental death or murder, whatever it is, all right? So now we got 2 barbiturates in her stomach. And then I was able to find a witness on the East Coast whose father was with the medical examiner's office, who said that 3 years after Dorothy died, a toxicologist there had kept some of her bodily fluids, hoping the technology would help them analyzed those specimens, and they found seconal, Tulinol, and phenobarbital, 3 barbiturates in her stomach. They also found a glass that had residue of phenobarbital on it, which meant that it looked like Dorothy drank vodka and tonics, and it looked like that they had poured, whoever decided to do away with Dorothy, that powder into that particular drink. So that's what I was able to determine about that, and then I tried to hook it up with, all right, how could she have been poisoned? And that led me, that led me to this particular guy, Ron Pataki. We'll show a picture of him in a minute, but Ron Pataki, if I don't have it up there now, we'll show it in a minute. Ron Pataki was a journalist in the Midwest, much younger than Dorothy, 22 years younger, and he kind of latched onto her right as she was investigating the JFK assassination, perhaps by accident, perhaps by not. They had a torrid love affair, according to her. He said they didn't, but I pretty much proved that that had happened. So on the night before she died, she went to P.J. Clark's, and then she went to the Regency Hotel, and that's where Catherine Stone, a witness who was on the last What's My Line program, Dorothy guessed her occupation as selling dynamite, saw Dorothy with a mystery man at the Regency Hotel bar. Now, Pataki, Dorothy shared her JFK assassination investigation evidence with him. And we believe that she thought, and we found that through Mark Sinclair, that he thought she was leaking her information to the wrong people. And they had a showdown that night at the Regency Hotel bar. We believe that, and I'll give you some more information about Pataki in a minute that really shows exactly what happened. We believe that he either poisoned her with barbiturates put into her vodka and tonic drink at the bar, or accompanied her home and did it there. Again, the facts are presented for you, and you can make up your own mind. But please put up the poem, one of the poems that he's written. I interviewed Ron Pataki 3 or 4 times. I told him I felt like he was the main suspect in her death. He made all kinds of, defenses against all of that happening, but I proved that, there was motive on his part because she was going to expose him as leaking her JFK assassination information. And there were other motives as well. So I was able to find on Ron's website this poem. Although he wrote 2 poems, one of them was, the first one that I found was, "Never trust a stiff at a typewriter. There's a way to quench a gossip's stench that never fails. One cannot write if zippered tight. Somebody who's dead can tell no tales." Who does that sound like? He said it was just a humorous poem. If that one's not bad enough, try this one. "Vodka roulette, seen as relief possibility. While I'm spilling my guts, she's driving me nuts. Please fetch us 2 drinks on the run. Just skip all the noise and make one of them poison, and don't even tell me which one." You know, one of the things that you worry about as a criminal defense lawyer is if your client provides facts that only the killer could know. All right? Those are facts only the killer could know. He didn't know anything about there wasn't anything publicized about how Dorothy had died. Proof positive that obviously he was involved some way in her death. Ron Pataki. All right, so then I'd written The Reporter Who Knew Too Much, and I could have quit right there, but I decided to write a second book because of 3 or 4 reasons. So, Reporter Who Knew Too Much, followed by Denial of Justice. And one of the things that happened as I was writing this, I always felt like kind of Dorothy was guiding me. And I'll tell you this, and you may think I'm crazy, I kind of think she chose me to write her story. I'm not sure why. If she did, I'm very honored that she did. But every once in a while, I'd get this idea or something. It just felt like she was guiding me along. And this is I was able to, through I felt some guidance from Dorothy, find the daughter of Dorothy's butler, James Clement. That's who this man is. And my wife and I went to New York City, and we were able to interview Brenda DeJordan, the daughter, and boy, it just opened the floodgates. She could tell us about the parties at Dorothy's at the townhouse, and Sammy Davis Jr. and Jane Mansfield being there, and Jane Mansfield taking off her clothes and her father having to help her put them back on. I mean, there's just some great stories that she could tell us. She could tell us about how her father took Dorothy's columns to the Journal American, all kinds of things. How the butler and his wife and the two children lived in the townhouse. So Barbara was a first-hand witness to what went on there. How they were permitted to sit at the dinner table with the other Killgallen children, like part of the family. And then she gave us some really strong news. She said that Jill, Dorothy's daughter, had said to her father, "My mother was killed." We have another witness who said that Jill said that as well. That they all knew that Dorothy was working on the JFK assassination, that her father said, "Be careful, stay away from Jack Ruby. You shouldn't be involved in all that." But of course she wouldn't listen. So we learned a lot from Barbara DeJordan, as well as, you heard me say, that FBI agents swarmed Dorothy's townhouse the morning that she died and took all of her documents. That's from Barbara DeJordan, and she knows that happened. In the new book, people ask me all the time, were the deaths of Marilyn Monroe and Dorothy Killgallen related? Well, as you may know, the circumstances with Killgallen dying. In fact, we should go back, if we may, to when Mark Sinclair found Dorothy Killgallen's body. If you'll bear with us just a minute, I need to be able to show you that video. If we could do that, I'd appreciate it. In the meantime, I'll talk about, if you would, Mark Sinclair 3. I'm sorry. Mark Sinclair is the one who found Dorothy Killgallen's body. These are the sad, this is the sad chronicle of that.
Did she tell you what her plans were for later that night after What's My Line?
She was going home afterwards.
Well,
But obviously she didn't, because she went to the Regency.
Do you suspect that she got a phone call after you left?
After I left, I think she got a phone call from somebody, and she agreed to meet whoever it was at the Regency. That's my belief, because she wasn't going to Clark's. She had asked me if I wanted to meet her because she did not have anybody she was going to meet with, and she was not dressing for a date.
Well, she did end up going to Clark's briefly with Bob Bach.
Well, maybe, but not long. But she might have done that and then gone home, but there wouldn't have been an evening like she had.
Why didn't you accept her offer to go with her somewhere?
I was tired myself. She had done something every day that week, and she had more appointments for me the following week. And I didn't want to see anymore. I wanted to go home.
Did she tell you that she had a meeting at her son's school?
Yes, on that was Sunday. I did her hair before the show, and she told me to come the next morning before 9. I arrived at the house at 9, used my key. I think it was about 8:30, 8:45. Used my key, let myself in, went upstairs, and Dorothy was dead in her bedroom.
You went to the third floor bedroom that she did not sleep in that room.
She did not sleep in that room. And when I entered, Dorothy was not in that room, but the air conditioning was on. It was cold out. That's the room.
What about that air conditioning vent? Was that?
No, that's the dressing room. Oh, no. That's a heater. That's not an air conditioner. This is the air conditioner.
Oh, that's it, where it would have been in that position.
Right in that same position. And it was blowing out in that room. And I was here. And the light was on, and she wasn't there. So I turned on my curling irons, and I walked into the bedroom, not thinking that she would be there. And she was sitting up in bed, and I walked over to the bed and touched her, and I knew she was dead right away.
And how was the bed made up?
The bed was spotless. She was dressed very peculiarly. She was dressed like I've never seen her before. She always dressed in pajamas and old socks, and her makeup was off, and her hair was off, and everything was done. She was completely dressed like she was going out. The hair was in place, the makeup was on, the false eyelashes were on, the matching peignoir and robe, book laid out on the bed, a drink on the table, the light was on, the air conditioning was on. Though you didn't need an air conditioner, you would have had the heat on, and she was always cold. And why she had the air conditioning on, I don't know.
Possibly someone else had turned it on.
Well, maybe to keep the body at a certain temperature, you know.
Was the glass on the bedside table within her reach?
It was on the right-hand side. No, it was way away, way over. And the book, it was turned upside down. It wasn't in the right position for if you'd been reading, laid it down. And it was laid down so perfectly, you know, like that. And one hand, rigor mortis had set in on one hand, the right hand, and it had drawn up the covers a little bit. And there was lipstick on this sleeve of the bolero jacket. And the light was on, and she was sitting up.
It's even better that we brought it up right here because I want to talk about Marilyn's death as well. But you heard him say, eyelashes, makeup, hairpiece on, clothes she never wore to bed, not in the bedroom she ever slept in, book upside down, no reading glasses, no nothing. Does that sound like a staged death scene to you? No investigation. Despite that, they took one look at an empty Seconal bottle and decided, for whatever reason, the ME office at that time was controlled by the mafia, by the way, that's in both books. Close the case up, be done with it. That's what they did, no investigation. So that turns me to Marilyn and Dorothy's death. No investigation of Dorothy's. Marilyn's barely an investigation. I will tell you right now, and one of the things I'm working on if I write a third book is this. The Marilyn Monroe's death was a dress rehearsal for how they killed Dorothy. A lot of similarities there. Drug overdose, found in a bedroom, all these other kind of things. That's something I'm going to investigate as I go along. Okay, here's Pataki, that was Dorothy's boyfriend that I told you about. One quick thing about him, because I want to move on a bit. Until recently, I couldn't quite figure out how Pataki ended up involved in Dorothy's death, whether he actually gave her the barbiturates or set it up or whatever. And these things happen when you're researching. I found a casino gambling boss in Las Vegas who told me about the mafia in Vegas and all of that, and then just by chance, while at the end of the interview, asked about Dorothy. He knew who Dorothy was and all of that. And I said, by the way, how about Ron Pataki? He said, well, sure, I know about him. I said, oh, you do? He said, yeah, we knew when Dorothy died that Pataki was around there because, as I understand it, Pataki had gotten himself in some trouble with the wrong people, and those wrong people were pressurizing him. And then they knew that Dorothy Killgallen was his girlfriend, basically, at the time, and they made a deal. You tell us what Dorothy's going to put in that book for Random House, and if you do, we'll get you out of that trouble. Well, we think that's what happened right now, because what this gentleman said to me gave me a chill when he told me. He said, Pataki told the wrong people, the people in the underworld, whoever they were, Marcello, anybody, whoever that way, the FBI guys, whatever it was, that Dorothy was going to connect, which we believe she already had, Marcello, Oswald, Ruby, and that she was going to show how that whole thing was orchestrated with bringing Melvin Belli into silencing Jack Ruby at trial. And he said to me, when Pataki gave that information out, his words, Dorothy was dead. Dorothy was dead. All right, so I decided to see if I couldn't get the New York District Attorney's Office to investigate Dorothy's death, and I got them to. They did told me they were going to do quite a thorough investigation of her death, but they really didn't. And all those details are in the book as far as how far they went and why they didn't go further and all of that. I also tried to do other things at that particular point to see if I could find that file of Dorothy's by looking into the FBI files and all of that. But then something happened that really made a lot of difference, and I want to be able to recognize somebody in the audience because that particular person, in my opinion, is a hero. I don't exactly remember when it was, but I got a telephone call from a man named Greg Mullinex, who was a lawyer in Fresno, California. He said he bought The Reporter Who Knew Too Much or audio tape of it in the afternoon and read it by the time he went to bed, and he had a gift for me. And I said, well, what's that? And he said, I have a copy of the Jack Ruby trial transcripts. That's Greg right there. He deserves a hand. And I'll tell you why. I'll tell you why. I missed them. All of these authors of these books that I'm going to talk about in a minute, they missed them. I think we all felt like that, Oswald or Hoover had brainwashed us all, that the Ruby trial transcripts were probably about what? The insanity defense and all of that, and so nobody took time to even look at them at all. Well, Greg was nice enough to trust me with them. 2,000 pages. There I am with those. This stack. Took me 2 weeks to go through them. 2 weeks. We would not have the Jack Ruby trial transcripts if Greg had not brought them along, and I'm so appreciative of him trusting me with them. So what did I do? I went through there, and I will hope you will be as shocked as I was. Here's the cover page. You can take a look at it. I embedded the Ruby trial transcript excerpts in Denial of Justice so you can read them. I didn't want anybody saying that I made up this stuff or whatever. So 4 things stuck out at me right away. Now remember, this is the foundation that we should have had for looking at the JFK assassination. This is where you start. Here's the transcripts right here. This is the Bible for the JFK assassination. Sworn testimony by witnesses who have no reason to lie, who were there, who saw everything. This is the truth. And yet, those people who knew about it, and I'll give you an example a little bit later, or those people who didn't know about it, we should have found it somewhere or another long before Greg did. But we didn't. And so we missed things. And when I went through there, I couldn't believe it. I was just shocked. I'm sure my wife will tell you I screamed a couple times. First of all, Jack Ruby, according to 2 witnesses, Don Campbell and John Newman at the Dallas Morning News, said that Ruby came there shortly before JFK was killed and stayed through when he died when he was shot at 12:30, and along with others, looked out at the window in the Dallas Morning News down the street toward Daley Plaza as the assassination was happening. He was watching the assassination, which means he must have known that it was going to take place. Dorothy Killgallen heard that testimony. And she always looked at little things. For instance, she never believed Ruby was telling the truth. Do you remember anything about him telling everybody that after the assassination at the Dallas Morning News, he was on a twist board, and he was trying to sell this twist board to the employees there? Well, she didn't buy that. If he was supposedly so upset about JFK's death and everything, he wouldn't do that. Dorothy Killgallen looked at the little things. But remember, she's sitting in the front row, listening and watching this testimony, and she hears Campbell and Newman say that Jack Ruby was watching the assassination as it took place. All right? Here's the one that really hit me, though. Jack Ruby, what did he say? Well, I just happened to be by the Dallas Police Department basement, right? I just happened to go down there, and they just happened to bring Oswald on, and I just happened to shoot him. Well, if you believe that, come on. But people have for years and years and years and years. Ruby trial transcript in the page. The conversation was about this man named Hallmark, who owned the parking lot across from Jack Ruby's Carousel Club. On Saturday before Ruby shot Oswald, he came over and asked to use the payphone. Hallmark stands there as he's using the payphone, and he listens, and here's what he said. Did Ruby say anything with reference to concerning whether or not he would be there or not when Oswald was transferred? Did he say anything on that? He told whoever he was talking to that he would be there. He would be there, yes. Stalking Oswald, no question about it. He would be there. It wasn't happenstance that he ended up there. And then in the Ruby trial transcripts, it talks about Ruby he made like a reporter. He told a witness he made like a reporter to get into the news conference for Oswald in the police headquarters and then get into the basement. And then he used his friends from the Dallas Police Department to get into the basement as well. I hate hate the word conspiracy. There's no conspiracy in this case. It's a plot to kill the president, and this proves it. It's always been in there, and we all missed it. Greg found these things, and I published them. So I've been looking for information where I could corroborate a little bit of this. The one thing about Ruby and the cops, and today I heard more information about that, I found Dorothy had written a column, claimed Dallas cops lived it up at Ruby's place, and she does this column. Many New Yorkers who worked in nightclubs operated by Jack Ruby in Dallas say they weren't a bit surprised at the revelation that Ruby and the local police were chummy. So chummy, he was allowed to hang around headquarters when they were questioning Oswald. The performers vividly recalled jam sessions at which Dallas cops joined in the fun, some playing musical instruments, others doing turns as singers and comedian at the Carousel Club. They also report that the town's police made Ruby's place their late hangout, enjoying parties with the strippers and their men friends after the official closing time. Dorothy found that. That's what she did. She found those facts. Watched the assassination, would be there when Oswald was going to be transferred, made like a reporter. If you hear about Ruby at the press conference or anything, he's holding a notebook and a pencil. He didn't just happen to get down there. He was part of the plan, Oswald was captured. Oswald's a loose end. You get rid of Oswald by Ruby, and then you shut up Ruby with Melvin Belli. That's what Dorothy found out. Now, I have some disturbing news for you. Some news that is disturbing to me, and I hope it will be to you. I hope you'll all agree this is primary source information. Dorothy Kilgallen's columns, and now we have the Jack Ruby trial transcripts. That's important material. I hope you'll agree. I assume you'll agree also that this kind of material must be a part of the 6th floor museum at Daley Plaza. That's where it should be, right? As part of the story, as the other side of the story. Oswald alone, all this. So people, teachers, children, researchers can go into the JFK Museum at Daley Plaza and look at all this material, perhaps that hard copy of the Ruby trial transcripts and all of that, and then make up their own mind about what happened. Wouldn't you agree that makes sense? None of it's there. I happen to be there myself today. It's not there. Why isn't it there? I had a personal experience with the museum this summer. I offered to give them more than 100 documents, videotapes, books, everything about Dorothy Kilgallen, as well as a hard copy of the Jack Ruby trial transcripts. And this was a roller coaster ride until I realized what was going on. I don't know how many of you have been to the museum, but if you go there, I think you'll get the same feeling that most people do, that it's almost completely focused on Oswald alone. I saw that today. All the exhibits about him, all of this kind of thing. There's only 2, and I wrote down the 2 quotes about Ruby that I'll tell you about. Otherwise, it's all Oswald alone stuff. It's all Warren Commission stuff. Yeah, they put up some conspiracy theories, but they're so absurd that they make no sense whatsoever. Remember the name of the museum, 6th floor museum at Daley Plaza. It points you directly at Oswald. So I was going to give them all this material from Dorothy. Remember, that's adverse, isn't it, to the Oswald alone theory. The Ruby trial transcripts that are adverse to the Oswald alone theory. First, they love the idea. Then they said the documents weren't originals, so they wouldn't take them. So I wrote a long email and said, you're not going to get originals of these things. They're authentic and they're accurate, and that's what you say you're after on your website. So they came back and said, okay, yeah, I guess that's all right, and everything. In the meantime, I sent them that material so they could look at it and make sure that they understood how important it was. So then they came back to me, and they said, look, we're going to send you an agreement. So this is the agreement they sent me. Well, I'm just going to summarize it. It's an impossible agreement. No person like me could ever sign it. And this is the first indication, really, that I got that they didn't want this, maybe the second. They demanded that I give them all the copyrights to my books, all the copyrights to books that I hadn't even written about Kilgallen. They had the opportunity to reproduce the books, make derivative works, distribute the books by sale or other means, perform the work publicly, display the work publicly, and use sound recordings of the digital audio transmission. They also could give me no guarantee that they would exhibit my material, that they would keep it, they could destroy it if they wanted to. That was the agreement that they sent me, signed by their CEO and by Stephen Fagan, the curator, and Lindsay Richardson, the assistant or whatever curator. Why would you send somebody who's giving you something for nothing, important historical documents about the JFK assassination? Why would you send them an impossible agreement? Well, I jumped out of my shoes and I got upset and everything else like that, and I told them I couldn't possibly do that. And so then, as I'm more suspicious about the fact that they really don't want these things, and can I trust them with them, they say they're going to send me another agreement. A month or so goes by, and then they tell me they're going back to their copyright person before they can send it. I'd had enough. I couldn't trust them. These are historical documents. I couldn't trust them, and I was told by several colleagues, Mark, if you give them to them, they'll throw them away. They'll destroy them. I want them to be part of the exhibits and all of that. I also asked them to speak at one of their programs about the Ruby trial transcripts, the most important JFK assassination documents in history. Do you think they would let me do that? Absolutely not. Now you're trying to think in your own mind, why would they do this? The museum is only alive because of the Oswald alone theory. Everything they have in there, they lose their relevancy. If you were to put in an exhibit the Jack Ruby trial transcripts and even the 4 excerpts that I told you about, that blunts everything about an Oswald alone theory. If you put Dorothy's research in there and put in her columns or some of the things that I've found through that, it's just going to blow away those things. That's why they can't take those things. They can't take the donation that I had. For instance, today when I was down there, Greg and his wife were there with my wife and I, and we went around and everything. There are 2 comments about Ruby. A Chicago native known for his temper and erratic behavior, Ruby had childhood ties to organized crime, although mob-related conspiracy theories, evidence suggests that he acted alone. His motives remain in doubt. They know that's not a true statement because they know about the Jack Ruby trial transcripts. In fact, Greg at one point, they offered to give them the transcripts. They said they had some, but they weren't in good condition. So he gave them to him, and what did they do? They didn't put them in an exhibit or anything else. They just put them in their files. They knew about what was in the Ruby trial transcripts, and they weren't about to do anything with it. And then Mr. Fagan, who's now the curator, Assistant Curator Fagan, about why, more questions than answers about why Ruby shot Oswald. Very difficult to know because we really don't know what was going through Jack Ruby's mind when he pulled the trigger. Ruby said he did it because of his love for President Kennedy, in part also to spare Mrs. Kennedy from coming back to Dallas to testify at a trial. But then those who knew Ruby well, he doesn't tell who these people are, his friends and co-workers, they suggest something different. They say that Ruby simply wanted to be a hero and thought he might receive a medal for shooting the assassination of the president. They envisioned him standing at the door of his nightclub, the Carousel Club on Commerce, as the man who shot the president. You look at the Jack Ruby trial transcripts. You look at Dorothy Killgallen's columns. You look at all of that. This is Boulder Dash. And I just wanted to scream today as I watched young children and older children walk into that museum with their instructors and see that junk, one side of the story, and walk out of there some way or another thinking that one person killed the President of the United States. To that extent, I finally filed a complaint with the Attorney General of this state, and I said that under the Deceptive Practices Act, if the museum wants to include certain things in its collection, it can do that. But it can't go out and say, as it does, we are the authority on the assassinations. We have everything you'll want to see. They send out material with advertising saying that, come to us. We want to show you everything, the truth about the assassinations. The truth isn't there. And now we know for sure that they're deceiving because they won't let the trial transcripts see the light of day or Dorothy's research. I'm still waiting to hear from the Attorney General whether they'll look into this or not. And you know, there's repercussions from this. A lot of repercussions. And what are they? Well, they are the fact that researchers, children, whoever it may be through the years, haven't known the truth. It's interesting to note that these books that have been written about the JFK assassination, okay? JFK and the Unspeakable, James Douglas. The Kennedy Half-Century, Larry J. Sabato. Moment of Madness by Elmer Gertz, written a long time ago. Even Dallas 1963 that talks about Dealey Plaza and other things. The Two Worst Offenders, Case Closed by Gerald Posner. Junk. Reclaiming History, this is the worst one, by Vincent Bugliosi. The Manson Prosecutor, 1,000 pages. I knew Vince. When I found out about Dorothy's research and the fact that she'd interviewed Jack Ruby and she was there and she did all this and the columns I sent him, everything, he said, yeah, Mark, I'll include that in the book. You think it's in here? Absolutely not. It's not in any of those books about the trial transcripts or Dorothy Kilgallen's research. And here's the worst one, this damn Warren report. Trash. Those books, I mean, I can't even believe I'm saying they ought to be burned because they continue to perpetuate these untruths. And we can't have that. This is history. People say, well, who gives a damn about Dorothy Kilgallen dying 50 years ago? Well, I do, and you should too. We want to know the truth. She gave up her life for her country trying to find the truth. People have called her a patriot. Two gentlemen go to her grave every week in New York and put flowers there. She is revered by everybody that knows about her. And she can't get a date at the JFK Museum. There are other examples I could give you of the behavior by the museum, but I'm going to leave you with this, and then we'll get on to Dorothy and summing up some things there. I got this flyer not too long ago, okay? And this is another deceptive practice. If you could show the flyer. This came through email, museum donor email. The 6th floor museum at Daley Plaza, it's Giving Day on September 19th. And I looked down through here and I wanted to throw up. Because here's the last sentence. Help us give all North Texas the chance to visit this Dallas historic landmark that changed the world. Arrogance. The landmark didn't change the world. What changed the world? The killing of JFK, the senseless death of President John F. Kennedy. And they send this out to people. Don't they have any shame? And I've let Fagan and everybody at the museum know. I sent them a copy of my letter that I sent to the Attorney General. And what have they done? Boy, they're really scared. I'll tell you, they're scared to death, to the effect that, if you'll go on to the museum reaction to the fact that they know the Attorney General is on the job. Now, what could they do? I've offered to meet with them. I've offered to talk to them about the donation again. I've offered to speak at their programs. Somebody speak about the Ruby trial transcripts. I don't give a damn who it is if it's not me. And what do they decide? Next week's the anniversary of the JFK assassination. What are the main two programs they have? The last day of Lee Harvey Oswald, a conversation with Ruth Paine, and the other one toward a psychological understanding of Lee Oswald. Just crazy stuff. And as I said, the museum damages to history. How many young people have written essays about this for when they get back to school? How many teachers bringing those kids in today? And I just wanted to say, wait a minute, there's more to this, please. Please, there's more to this. So what do we do now? Well, I'm hoping that perhaps with this presentation I can warn people out there. Be very careful taking people to the museum unless they clean up their act or close their doors one way or another, which might be the best thing to do, because they're not telling the whole story. And people are being duped by it every day and paying their money. You know, I feel like I've tried to have a contribution to history here myself. I've been very fortunate through Greg and through others to find information. I don't know why I got involved in this in the beginning. I don't. Maybe Dorothy chose me or whatever, but I'm a man of the truth like she was. I've tried to be Dorothy's voice. I've tried to tell people, educate them about what happened here. All right? And I'm going to keep fighting when government agencies and other people and authors and the museum and others try to close her mouth. They did it in 1965, and it's not going to happen again. The real tragedy here is that this woman died at 52 years old. 52 years old, she died. And that her mouth was shut. She couldn't write anymore. She couldn't do anything. She couldn't live a life that we would hope a woman like that could. I want to close by showing you, maybe you'll remember, that at the time there was a famous program or a popular program called Edward R. Murrow Person to Person. And again, I would say to you, go into the DorothyKielgalenStory.org. You can remember that. You'll see all the videos. You'll see all the photographs of her. You'll see her columns. You can read all that yourself and make up your mind. The Ruby trial transcripts, I posted those on my website, markshawbooks.com. You can go read those. Spread the word to young people especially about this. But here is the woman that they killed.
Dorothy, if you had to be confined to one job of the many that you do, which would it be?
Well, Ed, I love television. I have so much fun on What's My Line, playing the game, and I love our morning radio program, too. But I think that I would have to settle for my first love and my true love, the newspaper business. It still has me and always will, I think, I hope.
Well,
God bless you, Dorothy. Thank you very much.
Questions, comments, protests. This is a library where you can say what you want. Any questions? Yes, sir.
Do you believe that Kerry Colmeyer is the son of Johnny Ray? And also, did you ever, were you ever able to speak with Kerry Colmeyer?
Well, I think the Mark Sinclair says in a video that Dorothy told him that Kerry was Johnny Ray's son. The photographs of Kerry at a young age show that golden hair. I don't think there's any question about that. People ask me all the time about the 3 grown children. Well, I could never get them to cooperate too much with what I was doing. They didn't stand up for Dorothy when she died. Recently, I've tried to do a couple things that I thought might help with that. I actually sent Kerry Calmer day before 2 days ago, my books about Dorothy that the museum didn't want. Dorothy's books. She wrote a book called Murder One and a book when she traveled around the world in a race. I sent him the Good Housekeeping magazine. I sent him all kinds of things because I thought he ought to have them. And so I did that. People say, why didn't they cooperate? They don't have very good memories of what happened in 1965 and beyond. Dorothy was worried about Kerry because she didn't think Richard would take care of him. Well, she was right. When Dorothy died, Kerry went to live with Jill and then came back to live with Richard, and he threw him out of the house. I think it's 3 or 4 years later, Richard committed suicide. So they don't have great memories of what happened back then. And recently I had to make a choice to go forward with something I felt could bring the truth to Dorothy. But to do it, I would have had to have probably gotten the children into a court of law. And if I had done that, I thought it would be too embarrassing for them. I thought it would have been especially tough for Kerry. Dorothy just adored Kerry. You read this article, you'll see. And she changed her will so that he would get an additional amount of money in the will. That will was never found, by the way. We think Richard threw it away. So I'm still hopeful at some particular point they might help with an investigation. I don't know if they think their father killed their mother. I think they believe that Ron Pataki obviously was involved in Dorothy's death. but they also know about her obsession with the JFK assassination. And you see back then what they all thought. The 2 interviews you saw with the hairdressers, this is kind of amazing. Those are in 1999 and 2000. They waited that long to say anything about Dorothy's death. They never cooperated with anybody. And you know why? Because they said they're still scared. And I have had people, including Dorothy's second cousins in Arizona, who would only talk to a friend and not talk to me because they were scared. They said, we don't want to lose one more family member. Now, this is 40 or 50 years later, but they're still worried out there because all of them knew that what happened to Dorothy. She was killed, and who was she killed by? The same people who killed JFK, the powerful people, Hoover, Marcello, whoever else it may have been. So I hope that answers your question. I hope that at some particular point, you know, I've never heard from them, so I don't know if they're appreciative of what I've done or not. I hope they are, because thousands of people around the world have heard about Dorothy, and hopefully, you know, she's gotten her reputation back.
Yes, sir. You talk about Marcello, and he's kind of not very far down the beaten path. I don't know if you know who Jeannie Carmen was. Do you know who she was?
I do not. I'm afraid not.
Okay. Well, Jeannie was one of Marilyn's best friends.
All right.
And her children published a book posthumously that said that Johnny Rosselli indicated that Marilyn was killed by Marcello's people, and that it wasn't the first time that he'd done that sort of thing. And
no, I don't think it, if you don't mind, I don't think it would be the first time. He was a ruthless guy. His billion-dollar empire in New Orleans stretched to Dallas. In fact, I don't know if any of you, a good friend of mine out here, a fraternity brother, Steve Dillon, went ahead and called my attention to an article, a story on Channel 5, I believe it was, about Campisi, the Campisi, David Campisi, the restaurants that you have here, and the fact that he has a relationship through, I believe it's his, grandfather or something, Joe Campisi. Well, Joe Campisi and Joe Savillo were Carlos Marcello's underlings in Dallas. Joe Campisi actually had dinner, or Jack Ruby actually had dinner, and there's proof of that, at Joe Campisi's restaurant the night before he shot Oswald. And more than that, you know, some of these things it's hard to believe they didn't put together way back then. Guess who the first visitor was to Jack Ruby in jail? It was Joe Campisi. Mafioso, and they didn't link that in at all. They just missed all those things because they didn't care. They had Oswald, and that's what happened. So that was pretty interesting that way.
One more question, and this is about, there was a handwritten note on the autopsy report about CO2. What the heck was CO2 doing in her bloodstream?
You know, it's interesting. There are people, and I want to answer this, people around the world who study the JFK assassination, every aspect of it, every scintilla of material that they can find. I have great respect for them. I'm not one that can do that. I don't know anything about that. I don't know anything about where the bullet was or where the trees were or anything else like that. I'm a Dorothy Killgallen follower.
No, this was in Dorothy's autopsy.
Oh, Dorothy's autopsy. Yes. What, you said what was there? CO2. I don't recall, but it may have been in there, but we've never been able to figure that out, obviously, if it was. No. Sorry, excuse me for saying that. But the point is that people, I respect anybody. Point of view. Let me just give a shout out to this library. They permit all kinds of points of view about everything. Tom Keener and Jeff Timms, what if they said to them, what if they tried to put on programs that only favor one side or the other of things? Okay? They don't do that. That's what libraries are all about. That's what we should be about. We should hear all sides of the story, and why that damn museum won't do that is a tragedy.
Any other questions?
I'm cussing too much, aren't I?
That's okay.
Money. $6 billion. That's a $6 million operation down there, by the way, in case you don't know. That's what they take in every year.
We will cover all questions, but I want to go front to back so I don't have to do a lot of walking. Thank you.
Just
yes, sir.
One quick one. in your research, have you seen real, honest complicity from LBJ, Clint Murchison, and that group in all of this with the assassination?
Well, if I said I'd look at motive. If you want to look at motive, you can't probably go any further than LBJ. He probably benefited than everybody else. The problem with LBJ, and again, is the layers of, he was involved, Murchison, all these other people. Nobody's been able to kind of get through all those layers. That's a problem with Marilyn Monroe's death, too, is you can't get it through all the layers to who it was. Dorothy's is much easier that way. So the answer is no. But boy, if you look at motive, some people were talking about LBJ today, and the fact that obviously he could have been involved there, but I don't think they've ever been able to, connect him as much as you would like to see happen.
Questions, comments? Okay.
I'm curious if you have any fear for your life bringing this out.
Well, that goes with the territory in what I do. I've written books about Mike Tyson's trial that nobody liked. I've written books about Jonathan Pollard, the spy, that nobody liked. My email's been hacked. My Facebook page has been hacked. I've gotten some nasty emails from people, but I will tell you more than anything, I think I haven't worried about it too much because, again, it goes with the territory, but for the most part, it's been overwhelming response from people around the world who have just fallen in love with Dorothy. And I think because that's happened, they really haven't wanted to go after me too much that way. The criticism that I've gotten, some people weren't happy that I told the story about Carrie being an illegitimate child, but I felt like that was part of the Dorothy story because, just one quick, I don't want to keep you too long, but I'll tell you, she got really scared one time before she died. She woke up one morning in the New York newspaper. We couldn't find it, and we don't know which one it was, but we do know it happened. There was a picture of Carrie, and I have a feeling this was a warning to Dorothy. He was running across Central Park, and the picture was in the New York paper, and it scared her to death because she thought somebody was following Carrie. They were after her son. To the extent that, and we confirmed this because in a What's My Line program right after that, it was right near Halloween, they laughed about it on the show because she put Carrie in a limousine to trick or treat. And she was scared to death of what happened there. So, you never know what's going to offend people, but if you're looking for the truth, with this situation, you people don't have to do anything about it. But if you want to call the Attorney General's office or you want to send a letter there and say, hey, look into this, you can. I think in this day and age, we too often let things go by that bother us, especially when they're about the truth. We've lost some of that, I think, for some reason. Yes, sir.
Hi, thanks. Very interesting talk. And I remember that week in '63 very well. But there's something that Jack Ruby supposedly said that I think I got it from there. 30 years ago, there was a JFK assassination center at the West End when it was a popular place to go in Dallas.
Well, is that right?
Yeah, they had a lot of information there, but there's a comment that Jack Ruby made that take me to Washington, I'll talk, but if I stay in Dallas, I'm a dead man. I was wondering if you ever heard that.
Well, yeah, and I think it was part of that one where he said, I can't ever tell what happened, the truth, and all that kind of thing. Again, remember, I'm not putting down people who go for this Oswald thing, but Ruby was the key. He was the key. And Dorothy knew that. And that's why she focused so much on him and, exposed his Warren Commission testimony and interviewed him, and nobody else did that. She really felt like that he was the key in everything. So he may have made those statements and everything else like that, but again, you have to remember, nobody was listening. Nobody was listening. Those columns were out there. She wrote 8 or 10 columns basically saying the Oswald alone theory is baloney. And Ruby stood up outside there by a railing, if I remember, in a courtroom and said those things, but nobody paid attention. Why? Because Hoover was basically just brainwashing everybody. And I'm sure you know why. And some people have said to me, well, the JFK Museum down here is doing this to protect Dallas. Because if there's a plot to kill the president and people in Dallas knew about it, they should have stopped it. But if it's a lone nut, you see, then nobody in Dallas could do anything. And that's the same reason that Hoover did what he did, what he said, because he couldn't be held accountable if it's a lone nut. All right? And so I think all of that has to do with the fact that for whatever reason, nobody was listening way back then. I mean, Joe Campisi was the first visitor. Oh, I'll tell you another one. I don't know if you remember who Candy Barr was, the stripper, all right? Well, Candy Barr got in trouble for marijuana possession. Do you remember this? All right. Well, when I interviewed Bill Alexander, I didn't realize Bill Alexander prosecuted Candy Barr for that marijuana possession in front of what judge? Joe Brown, the same judge, okay? And who did Jack Ruby call after he got arrested or whenever it was? He talked to Candy Barr. I mean, there's a whole part of that nobody ever even looked into. And who was Candy Barr's fiancé at some point? Do anybody have an idea who that might be? Mickey Cohen, Belli's main client. And Belli handled the appeal for Candy Barr. I mean, there's a million ways you can go with some of this, but nobody figured that out. There's not one newspaper story about the fact that Mickey Cohen, Belli's client, one of the most dangerous mobsters in the country, that he's connected to Belli. If you had that, then you connect Belli to, and Belli statements and everything. It just didn't happen. Nobody was listening.
Yeah, just one other thing. A friend of mine, this was like 30 years ago, he passed away, but he knew Marina Oswald real well, and there was a passion of his, the whole thing. And he was actually quite famous at the time in his own right. The year he passed away, he was on 3 talk shows, but he said from Marina Oswald, he maintained that Lee Harvey Oswald he wasn't the primary guy. I forget exactly how he said it. There's people that know him better than I, but we used to like talking about that. It wasn't, it was not Lee Harvey Oswald. So I always believed that.
Yeah, there's a really good book. I can't think of the name of it, but it basically, this is an eyewitness who was a kind of a drug runner and other things in New Orleans. And it's his firsthand account of how many times he saw Oswald with Marcello at his office around there and all of that. I think it's pretty believable in terms of that connection there. But you see, Dorothy didn't go with that. She really looked at motive. Joe Kennedy double crosses the mafia. They helped him win Illinois and West Virginia. They win the election. If we win the election, we'll leave you alone. I have an eyewitness that I found, a very revered newspaperman, who was right there when Joe Kennedy ordered JFK to appoint Bobby Attorney General. What does Bobby do? He goes after those people, especially Marcello, because he hated Marcello and all of that. And what is Marcello doing as November of 1963 comes around? He is has a trial in New Orleans for racketeering. Bobby Kennedy helped orchestrate that, and he's about to be deported. Well, his back's against the wall. He's got to do something. He hates Bobby Kennedy, but if he kills Bobby Kennedy, Jack Kennedy will come after him with everything the government has. But you kill Jack Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy is powerless, and I will tell you right now, you can look it up. They never bothered those guys again. Now, I think that makes common sense in terms of what happened here, and then you bring Belli into it and all of that, but there's an awful lot of people who would disagree with me. Yes, sir.
Did you come across any evidence that Dorothy started her book?
Yes, good point. I should have brought that up. She was working on it, and she had showed chapters to, I don't know if you know, but Bennett Cerf, who was on, with her on What's My Line, he was the publisher, founder of Random House. The night before Dorothy died, at the last show, she showed him chapters of that book. We don't know what really happened to that, but 3 years later, the book Murder One, which is a collectible item right now, Murder One was published under Dorothy's name, and it was all about her trials and everything else. And in the preface, in the foreword to that book, there's material in there that looks like it could have come from a book that she was writing about the assassination. Yeah.
Is it possible that she told other people her suspicions or her findings?
Well, people have asked me, did she have a copy of her file? She should have had. Well, back then you couldn't go down to Kinko's or whatever, so she couldn't do that. Basically, all you had was a carbon, but she was very closed-mouthed about it. The only people she talked to about it were the two hairdressers and Ron Pataki. And we believe, anyway, that she didn't really speak to anybody else about it, except to tell them what she was doing. She didn't give them a specific. She just told them they're going to crack the case wide open and all of that, which was obviously an invitation to eliminate her, and then that's what they did. Yes, sir.
Yes. I'm not really sure exactly how to put this, but...
It won't matter, please.
This is kind of, whatever, assuming Oswald was guilty and Ruby were guilty and all that stuff, why should, Dorothy be murdered? I mean, if everything could exonerate them, is that the only reason,
Well, yeah, it's almost the same situation you're in with the Sixth Floor Museum. You can just about let anything into to the equation. You can let Dorothy's material in, you can let my material in, research, whatever it may be. All of that can be then considered along with other evidence that happens, and you can discount that and everything, right? You can do that. But you can't do it with the Ruby trial transcripts. And that's where Dorothy watched this. Remember, she's in the courtroom, she's listening. Oh, here's another thing. I always wondered, wait a minute, the reason that they found Jack Ruby guilty is because they didn't buy the insanity defense, or because they didn't, the insanity defense, right? Well, they didn't, but they had heard also the evidence of Ruby's actions before he shot Oswald, which were in the Ruby trial transcripts. And so the jurors had to have said to themselves, look, he couldn't have been crazy if he's watching the assassination when it took place, if he said he'd be there when it happened, if he snuck into the basement making like a reporter. I think we now know why the jury decided what they decided. So you can get around anything. People can say I'm crazy or Dorothy is or whatever, but that's sworn testimony, and it's believable. And if you listen to it, I think you'll feel the same way. So Dorothy had that information. That's what made her lethal. That's, in my opinion, what made her lethal. She was going to publish some of the transcript material that she'd heard, and it would have blasted away. I like to say in the book that I believe if she had done that, J. Edgar Hoover would probably have been indicted. Marcella would have been arrested. They would have put all that together and everything, but nobody was listening. Yes, sir.
This is actually all very enlightening. I'm actually just here for extra credit for class, but coming from basically someone who's really not even interested in this entire subject, this is...
Okay, good.
And I'm sorry, that sounds very...
No, that's all right.
It's actually very enlightening. You've definitely brought light to this whole situation. Like, clearly there's something more going on with the whole assassination. Like, I truly believe there's no way that it's just Oswald. Mm-hmm. But then that only raises more questions for me. And I'm just curious what your thoughts are as to, so since we've kind of more or less cracked open that it's not a one-man job, do you believe that Oswald is in fact the shooter as well?
I think he had a part in this. Certainly. Remember, Jess Curry sent everybody to the overpass. There are all these other things that happened during that. There a lot of confusion and all of that kind of thing. I just think it's unfortunate that they just focused in on Oswald, who said he was a patsy, but nobody was listening, and then stopped. They just basically stopped. I read something today. I think it was at the museum, as a matter of fact. It said that, and I'm not sure I knew this, or maybe you will, the assassination of a president at the time was not a federal crime. It was a local crime. So Jess Curry and his police department should have taken over this whole thing. Well, right away, what happened? Hoover marched in, took over, had all the documents sent to Washington, all these other kind. That's unfortunate, because I think, and Jess Curry has said, if he could have had some time with Oswald and his detectives and everything, he probably could have found out what happened here. But with Oswald, those who were involved in his participation, they couldn't let him live. I mean, they couldn't do that. You got loose lips there, and you got to get rid of him, and you got the perfect guy to do it. There's Jack Ruby, a wannabe, a big star in the mafia. That's what he wants, and you know, there's lots of reasons why they would have been able to recruit him, but he was the perfect guy to do that. One of the reasons is just common sense, all the friendships with the police. I saw today where it said that Jim Lavelle, you know, the detective that's holding on to Oswald, in the audio it says, and Jim Lavelle says, "Yeah, I saw Jack Ruby standing there with a pistol in his hand." Well, obviously he knew who it was, right? And yet, if you look at the Warren Commission, what'd they say? Oh, there's no evidence of Jack Ruby having friendships in the Dallas Police Department. Come on. Yes. Yes, sir.
You were talking about relationship there with.
Yes.
Now I forgot what I was going to ask.
That's okay.
That's what happens when you get older.
Think about it a minute. It's all right. It's all right.
The instance where Oswald Wagner Carr, the State Attorney General of Texas, this is what I was going to mention. He had actually had jurisdiction over the case because it was a state crime, and his state agency was investigating this until it was shut down by LBJ. And in his investigation, and I found this out because when he retired, he was a graduate of Texas Tech, and he donated all his personal property and papers to the Southwestern collection at Texas Tech University when they're all still there. And I went through there.
Who is this again that did this?
Wagner Carr. He was the State Attorney General of Texas in 1963. And his investigation turned up the fact, and this is in his documents that's in the collection at Texas Tech, that Oswald was a paid FBI informant. He was an informant number 179, and he was being paid $200 a month by the federal government. Now, ironically, when Oswald was arrested at the Texas Theater and brought back, the Dallas County Sheriff, when they were going through the contents of his wallet, they found a receipt for a government voucher for $200.
Wow.
What a coincidence.
No, there's no coincidences in life. That's fascinating, and that should have been followed through some way or another. I've never heard that before. I had no idea. When I said Oswald was a dead end, I shouldn't say that. He's a confused man. You can't ever figure anything out there. You can't come up with any conclusions because it's just all over the place, just like something like that. That may be the truth. Who knows? Dorothy didn't want to get involved in that. She saw Ruby as the key, and I do too. Yes, sir.
Mr. Shaw, let me thank you for coming and also thank Allen Library to put this program together. Just fascinating, and it's an honor to be here, and thank you for giving us this opportunity.
Well, it's my honor. I appreciate it very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. And again, I will say, I wouldn't be here if Tom and Jeff, didn't ask me to come. And they knew what I was going to talk about. They didn't have to. They would, feel like it's going to be controversial or whatever, but that's what this is all about. You want to present all sides of the equation, and I really appreciate that. It's a wonderful library. So.
Thank you. This young man is not my student, but I'm very glad that he's here for extra credit.
Yes, good.
As a statistician and also as a mathematician, I have studied this. Somehow I think my life has been it's a mystery that how I end up with JFK. It just amazes me. Coming from 10,000 miles away, and in '78 I was like a nanosecond away from Lee Harvey Oswald Marina. All was home. And then for 12 years I worked in downtown when I was teaching and passing by JFK assassination, that I guess so-called X, which I think is morbid to let cars drive by it, and that's my opinion.
Yeah.
And I do agree with you on the 6th floor museum. I never took my students there because I know it's just absurd.
It doesn't have to be that way either. It doesn't have to
Right.
be that way. If they'll be flexible about things, but it's difficult for them to do. How are you going to put the Ruby trial transcripts in there and then keep, they could call it the Sixth Floor Museum in tribute to Lee Harvey Oswald if they
Right.
wanted to.
Right.
That's up to them. But you can't go out and promote it as the landmark that changed the world, or we're educating people, or we're the place where you should come. That's deception to people who are paying their money. And the problem is, of course, they don't know what they're missing.
Right.
Because they don't promote any of that. They don't promote anything that's not pro-Oswald alone. So all of those people that went there today, they say they have 400,000 people come through there every year. When they come there, they don't know what they're missing. They don't know that the Ruby trial transcripts exist. They don't know that Dorothy Kilgallen's material exists. So they can only, watch and listen to what is provided for them. I don't know how the people at the museum look themselves in the mirror now this way, especially when they know about all this material and won't permit it to be in that museum.
One more thing I need to say, because this young man here, he needs to understand in 50s and 60s, even up to this point, the Russians do it very well. I think the term, if I translate it correctly, is called a sparrow. It's named after that bird. Usually they send a young, handsome man or a lady in order to, I guess, extract information from you. Recently, they just did it in Iran as well, to, I guess, undermine someone that they think is dangerous. So I think George Petak, it doesn't surprise me, or Ron Petak, sorry, it doesn't surprise me that why somebody must have set him up with Dorothy for that reason, to extract information in a romantic way. The Russians are perfect at it, actually. I mean, they've done it before.
Yeah, I should also tell you, Ron Pataki's still alive. He's 84, lives in Columbus, Ohio. I continue to pile up information about him and what he did, and I'm gonna end up getting him indicted at some particular point, because there's no question he had something to do with Dorothy's death. All you have to do is look at those poems for him to have had, some part in whatever happened. And I'm hoping that if we can get him arrested at some particular point or charged with a crime, that he will let us know what happened back then. So
By the way, before we're going to take 3 more questions, but we have on YouTube called Oswald's Last Call. We have 2 million hits. You'd be one of them.
Hello. You mentioned a couple of facts that I find very interesting. One is, after the trial, she went directly to New Orleans, right?
Yeah.
And that's where Carlos Marcello is.
That's right, exactly. And, again, I think the problem we have is I wish, that she had written down and we had what Ruby told her. We don't have that. But as I said, she didn't go anywhere else except she went to New Orleans, and that was where Marcello was.
Mm-hmm.
And she had a scary experience. That's why she sent Mark Sinclair, the hairdresser, back to New York and all of that. So we have to believe that whatever Ruby said sent her there.
That's a very important point that I didn't know about.
Mm-hmm.
And also, could you elaborate a little bit more? You said there were 2 witnesses from the transcripts that testified that they saw Jack Ruby watching the assassination. What were the witnesses, and what was their background?
They were, I have to go back to my notes, but one of them was, I think, a circulation manager, and the other might have been a salesman or whatever. They testify that, now you remember that the time that JFK was killed was 12:30. Ruby showed up at 12:40 or 12:35, one or the other. And apparently, we were trying to figure out how far away the Dallas Morning News building was, and it was quite a number of blocks down from Daley Plaza. But if you were there, you could have seen into Daley Plaza. How clearly, we don't know. But they had a window in the corner. And the one man testifies that Ruby got there, I think, at 12:25 or 12:30 or something, and was there until that guy left. And the other guy then testifies that he was there after that, and Ruby was there the entire time, and he was standing with everyone looking out at Daley Plaza as the assassination happened. And from that testimony, you get the feeling that they realized that obviously it wasn't by accident or coincidence that he was there for that. You know, he always said he was selling advertising or whatever. They don't mention anything about that. I think they were just of the belief that, you know, why was he there at that particular time? So that's their testimony, and I can give you the names. I gave them to you before, but I can give them to you, but they're in both of my books.
Thank you.
I was curious, when you're talking about Bobby Kennedy and J. Edgar Hoover, do you have a theory about Jimmy Hoffa?
I kidded Greg down here today that Jimmy Hoffa may be buried in his backyard in Fresno. You know, that's every time I think of Jimmy Hoffa, if you don't mind my saying something you'll laugh at, I think of Uber. You know why I think of Uber? Because if Jimmy Hoffa would have been alive when anybody started a service like Uber, they would have been killed. With those union people, they would have never put up with that at all. It would never, Uber would not be there today. Hoffa's just a mystery. Now, there's some, if you don't mind, there's another little connection I'll tell you about. There was a lawyer in Florida named Frank Regano, and he passed away, but I was able to interview his wife, Nancy. And he represented an interesting triumphant, if that's a word, triumph, whatever. Anyway, Carlos Marcello, Santo Trafficante, who is a gangster in Florida, and James Hoffa. And Belli was a very close friend of Regano's. And after the Ruby trial, Nancy Regano told me she was with Trafficante and Belli, and they were around and everything. And one way or another then, Regano said to Trafficante, well, what about Belli and Ruby? And he said, whatever you do, don't ask Belli about Jack Ruby, which meant that somehow or another that was connected in there. And here's Hoffa in that whole exercise too, and nobody hated Bobby Kennedy any more than James Hoffa. As you know, he tried to strangle him once in Washington. So that whole connection in with Hoffa, I really looked into that at one particular point in terms of his active participation in the JFK assassination, and I really couldn't find a connection there. It was much easier doing that with Marcello and Sam Giancana in Chicago. Yes, sir.
I had a question regarding about Mark Sinclair, who witnessed or found her body, Dorothy. No police report or personal possessions that were taken away, being investigated that you're aware of when you talk to Mark? I mean,
no.
If he was describing the whole room was kind of odd,
yeah,
you would think that he would say, "Hey, this is not. She didn't kill herself. Someone murdered her."
He left right away. He left right away after he found the body, scared to death. He didn't want anybody to talk to him or anything else, and he didn't talk for 50 years. And I will tell you that with Mark Sinclair, I hope that you looked at his, now this is information from a long time ago, right? And I did not conduct those interviews, all right? I know the people that did, they're very responsible. But if you watch watch Joe Tannehill, if you watch Sinclair, Mark Sinclair, and Charles Simpson, you kind of get a feeling that it looks like they're telling the truth. A couple times words, or they try to put them in their mouths and they won't do it. I think they're very credible in terms of what they said. And they were heartbroken when Dorothy died because she was so close to them and everything. So those are the kind of witnesses that I try to find. I didn't interview them myself, but I know who did, and I think they're very credible. Yes?
Hey, Mark, how deep have you looked into the Santo Trafficante end of that because of the connection he had with Marcello?
I think that's one of the most fascinating mafioso in history. A mild-mannered man. Frank Regano represented him, and really Nancy talked about what kind of person he was. That he was very low level, but he was he had people who could do bad things to others. She talks about on the day that JFK assassination occurred, that Trafficante, I believe it's Marcello, Yeah, Marcello, and she was a very young woman at the time, celebrated the death of JFK at the, I believe it's the International Hotel in Miami, toasting JFK's death. And it really bothered Nancy to the point that she left her relationship with Regano for a while, because it really upset her and gave her the feeling that they obviously had something to do with JFK's death.
Well, the reason I'm saying look into Santo Trafficante, he hated Kennedy, and it had to do with the Cuban Missile Crisis.
I think that's correct, and the casinos and the whole thing. Yeah.
Right, and supposedly he admitted to his lawyer in 1987 before he passed away that they killed the wrong Kennedy. They should have got Bobby, not John. Look into that angle, because
yeah, that's very interesting, very, very possible. Again, nobody liked Bobby very well. That's for sure. That's for sure. And who killed Bobby? JFK or RFK Jr. now thinks that Sirhan did not, that it was the other guy in the room. Who knows? If I had to guess, I'd tell you that they couldn't let Bobby Kennedy become president of the United States, the same people that killed JFK. They were about to let him become president of the United States. If I had to really investigate that death, and I'm not going to, but if I had to, I'd start with the same people who were involved with killing JFK, because they got rid of Bobby, right? So they're powerless and they're not going to go after him anymore. And now Bobby pops up again and he may become president of the United States. You're going to let him do that? Absolutely not.
Was there somebody over here? I thought I saw a hand. That was you, okay.
Yes, sir.
Basically, it was just a comment that I never believed the stories as they present them now about Kennedy's death. And there used to be a radio personality that used to say, and now for the other side of the story, or the other side of the page.
I think that's true, yeah.
Well, you just presented the other side of the page for me,
yeah,
to where I can just say to myself, I knew that wasn't true. It couldn't be. It just never made any sense.
Anything can be true, and I don't stand up here saying I'm right. But, you know, I've got to go along with Dorothy, you know. She loved JFK, and it was a senseless death. They should have never killed JFK. They should have killed Bobby. And JFK then was killed at an early age, just like Dorothy was. There's two people that should have lived a long time. And unfortunately, they both were killed at early ages. So, yeah, there's the other side of the story, but there will be people who will hear what I have to say, as they have done. I mean, I'm very blessed that with the two presentations I've made on The Reporter Who Knew Too Much and Denial of Justice, there's more than 100,000 hits now. And so I feel good that people at least have gotten that side of the story. They may not change their mind or whatever. I will tell you that okay, I'll just tell you this. I wasn't going to, but I will tell you this. I let the media in Dallas know about my sending a complaint to the Attorney General. And I asked them to look into it. And that includes a couple reporters with the Dallas Morning News. It includes a man with the editor down at the Statesman American in Austin, with all of them. And I also let a gentleman I haven't heard from any of them. And then I let a gentleman named Patrick Williams know at the Dallas Observer. I had a conversation with him the other day where the first thing he said is, I'm not going to do anything with this because I know it was Oswald alone. And why do I know? Because of case closed. That's my case. And I said, will you just listen to me for a while? And I gave him pretty much some of the information that you just heard. I felt like I was talking to a doorknob. He did not want to hear any of that, and he wasn't about to look into any of this at all. That's his prerogative. But as I said to him, you know, it's really too bad that you don't want to look into this. It's too bad you're not someone like Dorothy Killgallen. I don't think he appreciated that comment, but I said it anyway. You know, come on. You're a newspaper person. Follow up on this. See what's going to happen. It want anything to do with it. This is his Bible, not the Ruby trial transcripts, that's for sure. Uh-oh.
You've been instrumental in trying to get the DA's office in New York City to reopen the investigation.
Yeah.
Can you tell everyone about your efforts in that regard?
Complete failure. How's that? Here's what happened. 50-plus-year-old murder case, right? All right. So, Reporter Who Knew Too Much came out in 2017, and I wrote a long letter to Cyrus Vance Jr., who you may have heard of, gotten some bad publicity with regard to dealing with the leader of our country, DA in New York City. Sent him this long letter, and I said, hey, and I sent him the Reporter Who Knew Too Much. And the agent and other people, my wife even, I think, thought I was crazy. They'll never look into a murder case like this. And lo and behold, the next thing I knew, he told Sue Edelman at the New York Post, yeah, we're going to look into this. And I was as happy as I could be, and they promised a thorough investigation. So for the next few months, they gave me a former homicide detective named Richard Ramos as my point person. I sent him material through the email of witnesses, documents, evidence report, the autopsy. I sent him everything that way, and then we agreed to meet in New York City. I think it was June the 4th of 2018. At the DA's headquarters downtown. He was so excited. I normally handle embezzlement cases, he said. My dad is so excited, he started watching more What's My Line. I mean, this is just something I can't believe I got this case. He was so excited. And by the way, after looking at your book, I wonder if Ron Pataki didn't sell Dorothy's secrets to the wrong people. I walked out of there floating on air. I'm going to get my thorough investigation. So a couple months go by, and they let me know, Ramos does, that they're going to give me an update. I answer the phone, and I'm expecting some good news or an update, and this Eugene Hurley, who was the assistant district attorney assigned to the case, comes on the phone, and I knew right away there was a problem. And he said, Mr. Shaw, I'm sorry, we've looked into this. We can't find any harm that came to Dorothy. I said, well, what about the staged death scene? No, we can't find anything there. How about Ron Pataki, all the evidence that I gave you? How about the 22 witnesses I gave you? And then he finally said, got aggravated. He said, Mr. Shaw, I'm not going to argue with you. Besides, we don't know who did it. That's what he said.
Wasn't that an admission?
So I went ahead and I wrote another letter to him, to Vance, and I said, here's what he said and all of that. I put that in the Denial of Justice book. I appealed it. I filed a Freedom of Information Act. I did everything I possibly could, and they would never come back to investigating. I then went to the Attorney General of the state of New York and tried to get them to look into it, and they didn't. And so now I've come up with another angle that I think might work, because I'm not going to give up on it. But it really was disturbing because, you know, she still hasn't gotten that full investigation that I want. That's all I ask, is for them to do a thorough investigation of her death. And I don't know if that's going to happen, but I'm going to keep trying.